There we go. Hey, it worked. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Kleinman Energy Forum. My name is Mark Hughes. I'm the faculty director of the center and kind of, just the guy who follows around the amazing staff at the center, including Molly Simon, Lindsay Samahan, Lucy. Oh my gosh, Lucy, what's your last name? What? Corlett? I know that. I see your email address all the time, Lucy Corlett. And Bill Cohen, who is back there kind of giving me hand signals about when to kind of speed it up and slow it down and everything else. So we're all gathering together in person, which is totally the way to go, but there is also a rather large audience online who will be invited to submit questions during the Q&A. You should start listening actively from the very beginning and submitting questions so that we can make sure you can adequately compete with the presence in the room. I tend to kind of go for the hands instead of the messages, but I'll try to balance both of those with, I'm sure, some help from my colleagues. Today, we are very pleased to have our delightful colleague, Shuchi Talati, who is visiting us for a week as a visiting scholar here, and actually doing some work during that week for a course that we'll be teaching together that the students in the room are invited to consider, which is going to be on grand societal challenges, crossing the policy and technology divide in the energy transition. It's one of those courses that a lot of people talk about trying to put on, and we're actually going to give it a whirl. It'll be very experimental, kind of a prototype course. I think it's going to be a lot of fun speaking across that two cultures divide between people whose training has been largely in the social sciences or humanities and people whose training is in the STEM areas of science and applied science and engineering, and how much they need each other and figure out how to work across their disciplinary divides, their professional divides, and so on, to try to come up with solutions to very complex and significant challenges that the world faces, especially as they relate to the energy transition. So it's going to be a lot of fun. Sushi's a great expert on a number of these topics, and actually not unrelated to some of the things that she's going to be sharing today. Harold Laswell, the kind of great, one of the most impactful, influential 20th century American political scientist, kind of a New Deal, post-war period of influence for about 30 or 40 years, coined the phrase that politics is about who gets what, right? Kind of this Whitman-esque kind of Americanization of the Latin qui bono. And it's kind of defined a lot of important questions in political science since then, especially in the United States with our fragmented and often competing system of government and politics, government, and also governance. And Shuchi is going to kind of help us understand the role of governance. Governance is really about the rules and mechanisms that are used to provide, that are developed to ensure that politics, as it channels government action, creates outcomes that we care about, right? And these mechanisms, these governance mechanisms, are typically about who gets to have an influence over a decision, who gets to actually make the decision, what's the legitimacy of that decision as it relates to who participates in the process of decision making. And what's nice about governance is it kind of allows us to avoid a little bit of a dead end alley on kind of distributional versus procedural ideas of justice, right? Ideas about, well, as long as the process is fair, as long as the inputs are fair, the outcome is legitimate, as opposed to distributional justice, which really cares about what the outputs themselves looks like, right? And governance, these mechanisms that are about the rules that we use to make decisions in the public square, it inherently connects those things, right? In a way that I think fosters a lot more interesting both research and action. And the incredibly interesting substantive area in which Shuchi is going to be kind of discussing this lens of justice has to do with things that we are going to be facing. We're facing now. There's action underway on some very big topics related to geoengineering. And there's very little governance that surrounds those substantive areas. So she's going to walk us through a couple of super interesting cases. And then we'll open it up to questions in the room and online. Send those questions in now, please. And with, let me say just a few words about where Shuchi's coming from. She's, in addition to being a visiting scholar this week, she's a scholar in residence at the American University. She's doing some super fun policy entrepreneurial work there, establishing, designing, conceiving, advocating for a new nonprofit she'll tell us a little bit about. She's also the former chief of staff for our own, hi Nick, our own Jennifer Wilcox, who was the acting assistant director for the DOE Office of Fossil Fuels and Carbon Management. Shuchi was the chief of staff to that office. Turned out it was occupied by Jen, and before the permanent assistant secretary was named, so they've gotten to know each other, and actually Jen introduced us to Shuchi. We're very happy about that. And then before that role, she actually was on a AAAS fellowship where she was staffing Senator Al Franken, which is a phrase I love to say, it never fails to delight, Senator Al Franken, who was on the Energy Committee at the time. So Shuchi's done a lot of work since her PhD from Carnegie Mellon, which was in engineering public policy, which makes her so perfect to deal with the complexity across these divides. And since that time, not too many years ago, she's really done a lot of very interesting work. So we're very privileged to hear today's talk and looking forward to the conversation afterwards as well. Shuchi, come on up.
Thank you so much, Mark. And I think this is on. So I'm so happy to be here and to chat with you all about this super interesting topic. And so I think, Mark did a great introduction, but just to give a little bit more background about what I'm doing. So I'm currently building a new organization focused on governance, justice, and capacity building around solar geoengineering specifically, called the Alliance for Just Deliberation on Solar Geoengineering. I'm hoping to launch this organization early next year. And very excited about the kinds of work that I'm building that I'm going to dive into in this lecture. I'm also the co-chair of the advisory committee to oversee the ScopeX experiment, which is potentially the first experiment, outdoor experiment in solar geoengineering that's been proposed by researchers at Harvard. And as Mark mentioned, I was most recently a political appointee at the Department of Energy, where I was helping to lead the carbon dioxide removal portfolio. So I'm very steeped in these spaces, and I'm super excited to dive into this. So just to give kind of a brief overview about the things I'll be chatting about. So first, I'm just going to chat a little bit about what solar geoengineering and carbon dioxide removal are. I'm sure that a lot of you in the room have some background about these topics, so I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. And I'm going to chat a little bit about, why we're talking about these things at all. The fact that we're talking about them is controversial. And I think there are really important reasons as to why we're in a place where it's now important that we acknowledge that we have to. And I'm going to dive into kind of how we should be talking to them and how we should be making decisions. So let's start with what CDR is. So this definition on the slide is from the IPCC, but very briefly, carbon dioxide removal refers to a really diverse set of approaches that take carbon dioxide directly out of the atmosphere and then store it permanently, whether underground or in products. And there are a huge range of approaches that fall under this definition, including things like afforestation or soil carbon sequestration, all the way to things like direct air capture or enhanced mineralization. There is a lot of difference across the cost of these approaches, the way they store carbon, how long they store carbon, and kind of where they are in the R&D spectrum of whether they can be implemented now or if they will need to be implemented in the future, and the scale at which we can do that. And so when we look at the carbon dioxide removal space, it's accelerated quite a bit over the last few years, and there's been a massively changing landscape in terms of the different sectors that are involved with CDR and how they are talking about them. And so we've seen a lot more R&D across academia. We've seen a lot of civil society movement around how they're talking about it and whether they're talking about it at all. We've seen massive public sector movement and lastly, a lot of private sector investment and also entrepreneurship. And I'll get into a lot of that near the end of the talk to kind of talk about the state of where things are with this. The last thing I'll mention is that the IPCC and the national academies have now talked about the absolute need for CDR in the climate change response portfolio and has really brought CDR into kind of the mainstream of climate. Now, solar geoengineering, on the other hand, is an extremely different approach. It does not interact with emissions. Rather, it refers to approaches that reflect sunlight to cool the planet. So there are two main approaches that are kind of discussed in the literature. And so first we have stratospheric aerosol injection, and then there's marine cloud brightening. And so stratospheric aerosol injection would simulate what we have seen in the past from large volcanic eruptions where sulfate particles have been injected into the stratosphere, and they reflected a very small portion of incoming solar radiation back into space. And so if that were ever to be deployed, it would have global impacts, reducing temperatures and affecting precipitation patterns across the planet. Marine cloud brightening, on the other hand, would involve spraying sea salt into low-lying marine clouds to enhance their brightness and reflectivity. And so it could be potentially scaled up to have global impacts, but could cause a lot of other impacts at regional scales. And both methods are still very nascent and not well understood, especially given our low understanding of cloud physics. Our current understanding are based on natural or accidental experiments like volcanoes or ship tracks when it comes to marine cloud brightening. Our research has entirely been modeling based, and we have not yet done any outdoor experiments. When it comes to stratospheric aerosols, the most recent example came in 1991 from Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines. And in the aftermath of that eruption, we actually saw about half a degree of cooling that was sustained for over a year. And so we know this method would work relatively quickly and would also be with likely pretty low direct costs. I want to emphasize, however, solar geoengineering would not address the root cause of climate change because it's not addressing emissions. And that direct costs don't necessarily include monitoring or good governance systems, the costs of which could be higher. But when we think about how much deployment might cost for this relative to other technologies, it is quite a bit cheaper, which leads to a lot of governance concerns and considerations. In terms of kind of how solar geoengineering might work, it could actually help reduce a lot of major global risks from climate change, like temperature rise, the rate of sea level rise, and the frequency of extreme events. But there are still a lot of uncertainties around the impacts around regional weather patterns and precipitation, and also considerable debate around whether these uncertainties could be reduced to what scale without large scale experimentation. Just a couple other kind of risks to talk through. So the first thing that a lot comes up often when it comes to solar geoengineering is something called termination shock. And so this is the phenomenon that could occur if we deployed solar geoengineering in a vacuum without large scale carbon removal and without mitigation. And so in that case, if we were to stop suddenly, we would see rapid temperature rise and as emissions would still be accumulating. And so with that rapid rise, we could see really unprecedented impacts. Something else that often comes up is something called moral hazard, which is often mentioned as a risk around solar geoengineering. And so this is the idea that increased attention or funding on solar geoengineering would decrease the attention that's being paid to mitigation or adaptation. This is actually a similar argument that was made around adaptation in the 1990s, suggesting that adaptation would make people believe that climate change was unsolvable and we shouldn't reduce emissions. That thinking clearly has changed, and we're starting to see that shift around carbon dioxide removal, but not necessarily solar geoengineering. There are a lot of geopolitical risks when it comes to solar geoengineering. One example is, a single country might decide to deploy without international agreement, if they were experiencing a high level of climate impacts that was causing a lot of harm to their populations, they could decide to deploy, and that could lead to a lot of, geopolitical harm, especially if countries that were financially benefiting from climate warming could see that as a provocation. In terms of kind of where solar geoengineering is right now, research is in very nascent stages, as I mentioned, almost entirely modeling focused, and the first solar geoengineering experiment has been proposed by Harvard. And we can chat more about that at the end as well. So I want to emphasize how different carbon dioxide removal and solar geoengineering are. The way that they're evolving, perceived, and progressing are on very different paths. Carbon removal has, essentially already started with demonstrations being built, and the fact that, ideas around scaling and the way it's going to be built have begun to move into the mainstream of climate. Solar geoengineering, on the other hand, is still very hypothetical and nascent, and with far less public understanding. But they do share some commonalities in how people talk to them and why they matter to the climate conversation. And so I think first, it's really important to put CDR and SG in the context of mitigation and adaptation when we think about, why these solutions are on the table at all, and why they're in need of discussion. And so first, just to explain, what mitigation and adaptation are. So mitigation refers to actions that, limit the magnitude and rate of future climate change by reducing emissions. And adaptation refers to the process of adjustment to actual expected climate impacts. And so kind of the first thing I want to make clear is that CDR and solar geoengineering only exist as a portfolio of responses to climate change. The notion that doing solar geoengineering or carbon dioxide removal means that mitigation or adaptation would happen less, or that doing mitigation means that we can ignore solar geoengineering CDR aren't true. These are not mutually exclusive choices, and we will need a portfolio of responses to wholly address climate change. When we think about CDR and SG, it's also really important to remember that the risks that they pose have to be in the context of the risks from climate change. We have to think about the risks of not using them and how impacts might perpetuate around the world without these technologies as tools that we have. And so the last thing I'll mention here is that CDR and solar geoengineering exist because the ideal options and outcomes for addressing climate change are no longer enough. No one wants to be in a position to have to talk about CDR and solar geoengineering or even to consider using them. But that's unfortunately where we are. And even if we get to net zero emissions, impacts will continue for this foreseeable future. And again, I want to emphasize how different CDR and solar geoengineering are, and the way they're being discussed and the way that they're moving are very different. CDR will be needed to address the hardest to decarbonize sectors and to eventually address legacy emissions. And solar geoengineering, on the other hand, would be for potential impacts prevention while these goals are being met, kind of given the timescales needed to address legacy emissions. But both exist in the context of addressing impacts that will happen due to the fact that we historically have not done enough on mitigation. And so I kind of want to show this, these thoughts in kind of a graphical representation. And so this is a graph that's often used a lot to show one example of the potential relationship between climate change impacts, mitigation, CDR, and solar geoengineering. And so this first curve in red is a representation of unmitigated climate change. You kind of see a linear increase of impacts, as time passes. The second curve is if we hit some sort of mitigation target, which eventually, net zero, we see that impacts plateau, but they don't stop because there is a long residence time for carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide removal is the only thing that can bring that curve down by actually taking emissions out of the atmosphere, which is what I keep referring to as legacy emissions. And solar geoengineering could be considered as a potential temporary measure to address some of the impacts, to shave that peak until CDR is at scale. And so this kind of shows the interplay of these different approaches and really the absolute necessity of the full portfolio of options that we will need to address climate impacts. And once again, CDR and solar geoengineering can't and should not stand alone in the climate response portfolio. Mitigation has to always remain the priority, but we also need to think about how impacts will continue to affect vulnerable populations. So when we kind of dive further into why we're looking into these approaches, this is the figure from the IPCC special report at 1.5 degrees. And so this figure shows pathways to ensuring that temperatures stay below 1.5 degrees, all of which heavily rely on massive amounts of carbon removal. And so if you look at this quote, it says all pathways that limit global warming to 1.5 degrees with limited or overshoot project the use of CDR in the order of 100 to 1,000 gigatons of CO2 over the century. So that last part translates to about, let's say, 10 gigatons of removal by mid-century. So while there have been examples of really rapid change in specific technologies or sectors in the past, there is no precedent in our documented history for the rate of change at the scale required for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. And so to put that in perspective, 10 gigatons is roughly the equivalent of double the total annual global oil output. And right now, the United States emits about 6 gigatons of greenhouse gases a year. And so we've never before witnessed such widespread rapid transition in human history. And to emphasize, carbon removal is necessary. This scale is necessary, but it likely won't be sufficient to limit harm. And so solar geoengineering might be a tool to address the impacts that are going to be increasing in frequency and intensity where adaptation is insufficient. So pivoting to kind of how these ideas fit into justice. So justice is the protection of basic rights, the fair treatment of individuals, and equal opportunity of all to participate in the decision-making processes that govern their lives. So there are 3 types of justice, and so I'm going to talk about them and how they kind of relate to climate change. So distributive justice is the fair distribution of benefits and burdens across a society. So in the context of climate change, that means we have to do more to protect the areas that are most vulnerable to climate impacts and that are already experiencing climate impacts today. Procedural justice is equal opportunity to influence decisions and deliberations. And so in thinking about climate, we know that that's not the case for how decisions are being made right now. And inclusive and participatory decision-making will be crucial for climate. And as we think about the emerging decision-making structures around carbon dioxide removal and how we may eventually build frameworks for solar geoengineering, it's even more important that we build these structures equitably and legitimately from the start. Restorative justice thinks about kind of the atonement for historical injustices. And so for climate, this raises really important questions like how and should rich nations compensate for climate harm? Or how can nations that are causing negative climate impacts restore or make whole those who are suffering from harm? And so when we think about how these ideas intersect with CDR and solar geoengineering, there are a few things that I want to mention. There are justice risks in the use of these technologies, and that's often been the focus of the discussion in this space. It's an incredibly important consideration and not one that I want to gloss over. But there are also important justice considerations in how use of these technologies might happen. And there are also justice reasons as to why CDR and solar geoengineering need to be discussed and gets to some of the previous points that I've raised. So when we think about how to apply a justice framework to these emerging technologies, it's incredibly complex. We have to think about how these technologies might evolve, who are in positions of power to make decisions, and how political structures might affect those things. And the answers look very different for carbon dioxide removal versus solar geoengineering, which is really important when we think about how these technologies are different. What's common among the two, however, is that global North elites and countries have had a very outsized voice in dictating what we should do and how we should do it. And that's true for climate as well as these emerging technologies. When we think about legitimate and just outcomes, that means we're going to have meaningfully participatory decision-making that looks very different than what we have today. There are also implications here for the intersection of colonialism and these technologies as well. And I think that's a very complex space, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A, but I won't spend too much time diving into that. So this takes me to my next slide, which is how are decisions made? And so this is the idea of where governance comes in. And so this is the IPCC definition, which I'm not going to read because it's very long. But what it essentially means is what Mark said earlier. It's formal or informal rules that are meant to dictate outcomes. And so one thing I want to emphasize is that oftentimes governance is thought of restrictive measures to control the space. But it's really important to remember that governance also means processes or actions that can enable as well. And so a few examples of both types of governance include things like codes of conduct or civil society advocacy or even funding. And so when we look at things like who participates in that space, it's not just governments. There are a lot of non-state actors that are very influential in how governance progresses and is built. And so places like academic institutions and scientists, funders, civil society organizations, intergovernmental organizations, and the public sector all participate in how these kinds of standards and norms are built. And so when we look at kind of where governance is right now, it's very different for solar geoengineering and CDR. And so for solar geoengineering, we don't have formal governance on an international level across the RD&D spectrum, but it is starting to form at the national level in some countries. There are no international frameworks that can form or conduct decision-making in the solar geoengineering space, but we are seeing some also informal non-state mechanisms for research that are functioning at smaller scales. So it looks very different for CDR, which is starting to accelerate at a much faster pace, especially in the United States. There's an incredible amount of funding that has materialized over the last couple of years and growing interest from a lot of different kinds of organizations. CDR is more distributed though, which means decisions are less inherently global in nature, even when decisions domestically could have global impact. So when we think about how we should make decisions rather than how decisions are currently made, this idea of good governance starts coming into play. And so from my perspective, good governance lives at the intersection of justice and governance. And so there are a few sets of principles that have attempted to define what good governance is, but this is a condensed set of higher level guidance that I think successful and good governance will adhere by. And so the first is that governance should align with and promote justice. And that means that it must be inclusive, that climate vulnerable communities and nations should be able to participate and represent their own interests. And it has to develop early. We need to develop norms and standards that can address risks and harms for research and for potential deployment. It should build legitimacy. We need equitable and just processes that promote responsibility, transparency, diversity of thought. And finally, governance is the only thing that we can ensure that carbon dioxide removal and solar geoengineering don't deter emissions reductions and adaptation efforts. And so there are a lot of gaps in getting to good governance for both carbon dioxide removal and solar geoengineering. And so these are a few overarching areas that I want to highlight. And so the first is around knowledge. Foundational knowledge in CDR and solar geoengineering, science, policy, and governance is needed across the global north and global south, and is a major gap across many, many regions. It's going to require a lot of resources, but the ability to engage in international fora is really only possible through an informed set of participants, which means policymakers, civil society organizations, and scientists across a really diverse set of countries. So next is participation. We're going to have to build processes for robust public engagement for multiple sectors and at a range of scales that will need to serve very different purposes. And so this includes things like co-developing research and policy priorities, or participating in different types of decision-making processes, and to advocate for preferences. And so finally, as I mentioned, we don't have any international decision-making frameworks for CDR or solar geoengineering. We're going to have to work collaboratively to build equitable structures that are capable of making binding rules and agreements for both research and deployment. So I just kind of wanted to touch on where things are right now before kind of wrapping up. And so, as I mentioned, these things are moving on very different paths and in very different ways. And so when we think about carbon dioxide removal, this field has shifted significantly and massively over the last 5 years. In this administration alone, we have seen over $5 billion being not only written and proposed, but passed. It is now at agencies. There are over $5 billion being dedicated to direct air capture hubs, research and development, and carbon storage and utilization. We've seen major legislation passed like the IRA that included tax credits for direct air capture. We've seen a huge growth in how different civil society organizations are participating in CDR. The National Academies of Sciences has written 2 major reports on carbon dioxide removal in 2015 and 2019 that have been very influential in how Congress has interpreted how to move forward on CDR. And finally, we're seeing a lot of increasing international attention around how to move CDR forward. And I think one of the most interesting examples was at last year's COP, where a mission innovation for CDR specifically was developed with the United States, Canada, and Saudi Arabia, and now with participation from a lot more countries that were announced this year. So solar geoengineering is very different, right? We're not seeing the same kind of huge efforts behind it or huge push, which is probably a good thing right now. We don't have enough knowledge, we don't have enough governance structures to make sure that responsible and just actions are, ensured in how we see outcomes. But we are seeing solar geoengineering rise up on the radar of the climate mainstream. Just this past week, Bill McKibben wrote an article about solar geoengineering in the New Yorker, and it was written in a way to talk about how solar geoengineering might be necessary. That's an incredible shift from how he talked about this topic, maybe even 10 to 15 years ago. We're starting to see increasing research and support. And so in fiscal year 20, we saw the United States for the first time have dedicated funding to solar geoengineering research. It was a very small amount, it was $4 million, but that more than doubled in FY21 and increased again in FY22. At the same time, in that same appropriations bill, we saw Congress ask the White House to write a research agenda for solar geoengineering for the very first time. That research agenda has not yet come out, but could be very significant in understanding how research might move the United States, but even more consequentially, how the international community perceives the United States moving on solar geoengineering. One of the biggest concerns around solar geoengineering is that it could be co-opted, by militaries or by efforts that wouldn't be transparent. And so having this report come out in a public way is going to be really interesting to kind of see and watch the process of. We saw a significant National Academies report come out in March 2021 around solar geoengineering that advocated for a $100 million public research program. And finally, as I mentioned, the ScopeX experiment has developed a governance process around kind of how we should build models for public engagement, transparency, oversight, kind of legal and financial alignment, and has been, a very important model to see how it could be implemented for future outdoor experiments. And finally, there is developing UN interest. There's been resolutions that have been supported across many countries at the UN Environment Assembly a few years ago. Over the last year, we've seen growing interest from the UN Human Rights Council, from UNESCO, and from UNEP. And so there's a lot more to say there, but I have limited time, so I'm going to stop myself. But so to kind of end, I just want to talk about what I think is really needed to get to a more just space. And I think a really important thing to say here is that ideal just outcomes are always good goals to have, but very hard, if not impossible, to achieve. And so what we can do is try to achieve as unjust an outcome in a non-ideal space, as just as we can be. So, and to get to what we need for that, we need to have more capacity building for research and governance across CDR and solar geoengineering. We need massive amounts of civil society and policymaker involvement. And so when I talk about civil society, I mean NGOs across the civil and across the climate and environment space, across a diverse set of countries. I mean things like labor unions or academic institutions, and so many different kinds of organizations that kind of fall under this set of kind of public participation that's outside of government. That said, we need state and local, regional, and international governments to be involved in kind of how we are considering this topic and how we should move forward. We need the participation of more climate vulnerable and host communities. These are the places where impacts are happening or where potential projects will be built. And they deserve not only to have a seat at the table, but to be decision makers at that table. We need a lot more collaboration across the global north and the global south. Right now, there are incredible silos in how decisions are being made, and very little movement on shifting those kind of dynamics that have existed for a really long time. And lastly, we need participation of international institutions and intergovernmental organizations. Fostering that regional collaboration is how we get to a lot more kind of involvement of different geographies and different regions who might not be aware of a lot of these conversations that are going on. So I'll end there, but this is my contact information. Would love to chat with anybody more about these topics, but thank you so much.
Great. Oh, all right. This is my last few moments of comfort before Bill makes me sit. There it is. Sit in those stools. I have a bunch of questions, but I'm also going to be very generous in sharing the time. I'm going to write them down because I left my pen up here and my cognitive decline is such that I can't always remember things. So in fact, let me start with one. I also suspect that the slide before last was kind of related to the mission statement that you have in mind for your new organization, right? And I really want to get to that. I want to hear about, kind of what's your theory of the problem that the organization is intended to kind of confront. I think that'd be interesting. But let me start with at least one, and I will defer. Maybe I'll trade with you for a while back and forth. But let me start with this one, which is, the legitimacy quality of good governance rules is so useful, it seems to me, because it really binds the more powerful and the less powerful in the process, right? Because the powerful benefit from legitimacy because it kind of stabilizes the decision making that they may well dominate, but if it's perceived as legitimate, it's a little more stable, right? So it's kind of a very powerful thing. And yet so much of the legitimacy mechanisms that we have kind of figured out are based in the state, right? They're based in the nation state. And even those are challenging, right? But when you've got this kind of common, whatever it is that the nation is supposed to be, kind of cultural connections and the sense of common citizenship and so on, legitimacy is a little bit probably easier to build. How do you build, what are your thoughts about how you come up with a legitimate set of good governance rules on either of these topics, but especially on the solar geoengineering at the global scale? Like, what's the way we build legitimacy around global decision making?
I mean, it's an insanely hard question, and I think it's something that we've been grappling with across many topic areas and across different technologies within climate itself. But I think what's really key to legitimacy for me is participation. And if you don't have input that is considered diverse, that is considered meaningful, there really won't be legitimacy in outcomes, no matter what you're doing. And I think we see that for both solar geoengineering and CDR. And I think a really good example of that for CDR right now is in building the first direct air capture demonstration plants. If we don't build processes that are fostering meaningful engagement, that's fostering co-decision making with communities where these might be built, these plants will not be successful. And we've seen that in the past when it comes to carbon capture and storage, which is a point source emitters of carbon dioxide. But these plants will dictate the future of the industry. And I think one of the biggest concerns that's been brought up from environmental justice organizations and a lot of communities that have been harmed in the past is the connection of the fossil fuel industry to carbon dioxide removal. And so ensuring that these kinds of good governance measures are built in is going to be essential for legitimacy and outcomes. I think for solar geoengineering, it's a lot more complicated because when you deploy, or if you deploy solar geoengineering, it's inherently global. So you don't have kind of a built-in set of stakeholders that is as clear as it would be for carbon dioxide removal. And I think a really good example of that is with the ScopeX experiment. And so, last year, the research team had proposed to do the engineering test for the platform for the experiment in Sweden, not for the experiment itself, but because it was just the engineering platform test, there was an engagement that happened with communities in Sweden. And, we saw what basically happened was the Sami community was very upset that they weren't brought in as part of a participatory discussion. It ended up being a multilateral conversation about how the processes didn't make sense for what they were proposing. And the experiment was delayed. It didn't happen. And you know, if it did happen, or if the experiment actually were proposed there, the outcomes, we don't know if the outcomes would have been trusted. And I think the outcomes of solar geoengineering research being trusted as, you know, if we find that it might be a useful tool in limiting impacts, having trust in those outcomes is incredibly essential. Because if we don't, I think we could see like massive global chaos if we were to deploy, and for people to think that bad outcomes were happening because of solar geoengineering versus because of climate change. And we don't have the answers to those questions yet because we haven't done enough research. But I think the legitimacy question is, I think, one of the most critical in dictating how the field is going to evolve. If you don't have diverse ideas, you're not going to have good enough research. And so it's not just that you should do it, it's that you actually need it. So I'll stop there.
Oh, that's great. That's great. And I'm going to do the thing that you guys, I'm not going to let you guys do, which is let me ask a follow-up question on that. And then really, if you guys, please start raising your hands because I want to stop talking too. Because of the way you answered that, it was a great question, great answer, not a great question, a great answer on, you know, the participation as the antidote, as kind of the catalyst for legitimacy. It's good. Still hard to do, participation and design it, but here's something else I want to ask because of the way you answered that question. So it seems like, you know, CDR, for a whole bunch of reasons, some of them technical, is kind of it's a free rider problem there, right? We may not do enough of it, right? Because we may not be able to adequately price externalizing this kind of global benefit, right? That we know we want more of. And because some of the potential harms are highly localized as well, right? We've got kind of at least some frameworks in the United States and elsewhere to try to deal with that and so on. So it's kind of it's one thing. And then solar geoengineering is more of a free driver problem, right? Where somebody might do too much of it or do it in an uncontrolled way. It's also cheaper, I guess, right? So a lot more people can do it. And so but here's the question. So with those kinds of differences in their dynamics, especially related to governance, what do you think they have in common? Like I'm curious why either at the scale of a talk or at the scale of an organization potentially. Is the organization about both, or is it mostly?
It's just for solar geoengineering.
Well, that may be the answer. What do you think they have in common, if anything?
Yeah, I mean, they've evolved in a common way in terms of how people perceive them, which I think is really important. They kind of evolved under this kind of geoengineering umbrella where they were these emerging things that people thought were crazy. They were both taboo for a very long time, and have started to kind of diverge very significantly in recent years. And I think they should be separate. But I think what they have in common, and you know, the reason I combined them for this talk, is that they're both very early and they both have the opportunity for governance systems and for a justice framework to be built into how they might scale or evolve in the future. I think they both are important for addressing the climate change impacts that we have no other way of addressing. You know, when it comes to impacts that are going to continue, carbon removal is the only thing that can address legacy emissions, and that can actually bring us back to a state where we're not seeing any more impacts from climate change. Now that's very far away. That requires a massive scale of carbon removal. That's going to take a really long time and cost probably in the trillions of dollars. And so when we think about other ways to address impacts, there's adaptation and there's solar geoengineering. And when we think about adaptation, what that really is adjusting to climate impacts in ways that can protect people. But there are climate impacts that you can't adapt to. And so that's kind of where solar geoengineering comes into play, potentially, right? We don't know if it's going to make sense or not. But when we think about kind of the climate justice perspective of protecting the most vulnerable, the reason I think almost anybody who works in the solar geoengineering field does it because of its potential to limit human harm. And I think that's where both of these two approaches kind of come together.
Good. All right, so she gives really good answers. So let's have some really good questions from the room. Angela. It's kind of inside baseball, but okay.
But This question is about, how to ensure this equity and justice, considering that one of the principles that you mentioned there is to prioritize adaptation, mitigation and adaptation, which are way more expensive than geoengineering. And we have seen at COP, developing countries requiring, a lot of financing for adaptation purposes because precisely those costs. So when you consider the cost and how cheap this technology is compared to the others, how do you impose these developing countries that they have to prioritize the reduction of emissions or adaptation and not to go directly to this?
That's a really good question.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
when I say prioritize, I mean like the people who have the money and are dictating those decisions and who are emitting need to prioritize getting those to zero. That's not to say that we may need something like solar geoengineering in this kind of in the next several decades. And even as we get to net zero emissions, there will be impacts over the next several decades. And we're going to see impacts continue for several decades after that. And so it's, I think the difficulty with that is that there's still deep uncertainty on knowing how solar geoengineering might work. We haven't done enough research to understand, as fully as we can, what the impacts might be on different regional weather or precipitation patterns, how it could harm food security or water availability, or how it could help. And I think one of the most challenging parts is the heterogeneity of those impacts, and we don't yet have a good understanding of what those are. And I think one of the biggest challenges with solar geoengineering is that some of those uncertainties can't be reduced until we do much larger scale experimentation, which is essentially a small amount of deployment, right? Because it's inherently global. And so when I say prioritize those things, it's because we know those things work. We know we have technologies and implementation processes for mitigation adaptation, and we know that we're going to have to do those things regardless. Solar geoengineering really can only be a temporary measure to help kind of mitigate impacts while we are doing these other things. It can't exist in a vacuum because of these things like termination shock or allowing emitters to keep emitting. And another thing about solar geoengineering too is that it doesn't address emissions, so it doesn't address every climate impact. It's not a band-aid on the entirety of climate change. It could address really big impacts for a lot of different regions, but again, there's just too much uncertainty there for us to be able to say that this should be a priority right now. But it's something that we need to be talking a lot more about, something that we need to have a lot more people involved in thinking about the types of research questions we should be asking, because that's really limited essentially to the United States and some of Europe right now.
Yes. Hi. Oh, Simon, now I can see with your mask off. Thank you.
Hi, Shuchi. Let's see. It's a bit of a follow-up question. There's a novel called Termination Shock. I don't know if you've read it.
Yep.
Yes, yeah, a wonderful novel. And it's about a sort of rogue alliance of countries, companies, others, right, who off the radar undertake to do solar radiation management. And one of the countries that's involved is the Netherlands, but it isn't the government directly. It's actually the former queen, if I'm not mistaken, right? And that's a delightful part of the narrative. But it connects, I guess it connects to a bunch of things. One is it going to be, you said, the major impulse behind this research is to limit human harm. But there is equal reason, I think, to suspect that a major impulse is to protect assets, right? And that, in the case of the Netherlands, let's say, that gets very interesting because, they're confronting a decision essentially as to how they're going to adapt, whether that will involve managed retreat or whether that will involve advancing with higher and higher seawalls. And if solar radiation management or solar geoengineering would provide them with the opportunity actually to duck huge adaptation costs either one way or the other, or at least to kick that can down the road. And that would be, I think, immensely tempting to them. So that's part of the question. And I could ask many more, but I'll just throw in one additional one that's connected to that. Can you speculate, or do you have any reason to want to speculate as to how the conversation or about solar geoengineering is playing out sort of in back rooms?
Sure. So I think to your first question, it's true. I mean, there's no getting around kind of how solar geoengineering could be beneficial to really rich people or countries. But I think it's also true of mitigation, right? I think, there's a reason why mitigation and climate change impacts are so important to really rich countries. It's to protect their countries, right? And I don't think solar geoengineering is any different. It can't escape those dynamics. I think the dynamic that I think is much harder to grapple with is the idea that it's cheap and that it could be done independently by companies or actors that are not governments. And I think this is kind of where this idea of good governance comes into play, and why I'm so interested in having these conversations right now is building these systems in a just way that limits that potential for rogue actors that aren't taking participatory input in how they're kind of moving forward. And I think without these conversations and without a lot more involvement from civil society and policymakers in this conversation, the more likely I think outcomes like that might be, right? And I think sometimes it's a really interesting thought experiment to think about. I think the idea of a rogue actor doing this has been part of the solar geoengineering conversation for a really, really long time. But I think what's more likely is political demand from a lot of countries that are experiencing impacts like the massive heat waves we saw in India or the massive flooding we saw in Pakistan. And I think that will be a lot more public. And I think that's something we're not really grappling with as a climate community, of how the political demand might shift very quickly and what that might do. And then, I'm sorry, remind me of your second question. Oh, the back rooms, the back rooms. Yeah. I mean, the solar geoengineering community is very small still, and I hope that changes very quickly, but there really isn't, there aren't that many backroom things happening. I think, we've seen some processes move forward in the US. I think this White House research agenda, I think, will be a really interesting kind of first public output. I think what's interesting to me is that the consultation process for that White House report wasn't super expansive. I don't know if that's a backroom thing, but I feel like it is limited to a very small set of people that don't necessarily have solar geoengineering governance expertise or background. I think when it comes, and I think there's a lot of speculation around solar geoengineering has been around moral hazard and this idea that fossil fuel companies would support solar geoengineering so they can continue business as usual. And I think that that's a very legitimate concern. From my background in this space, I don't think any fossil fuel companies are having those conversations in the background. If anything, they're having CDR conversations because that could be a potential profitable industry for them, which I have a lot of thoughts about, which is an entirely different conversation. But yeah, and I think the last place where backroom conversations could be happening is the military. And that I have no idea. That could be happening. DARPA did look into this topic 10 years ago. They could be looking into it now. The CIA was one of the investors for the National Academy's reports, or not, sorry, investors, funders of the National Academy's report in 2015. So we know the intelligence community is thinking about this. And I don't know, I think their intent there is largely around, I think, impacts and the national security fallout. But I think a lot of conversations are happening there, and we don't publicly know what those are.
So I assume that what distinguishes the rogue actions from the Harvard experiment is some safeguards around the experimental design. Do you know how tough the trade-off is between a safe experiment and adequate learning that we could base some kind of policy design on?
I think it's hard because it just hasn't happened yet. And I think for ScopeX, it's the first model where this advisory committee has existed to oversee a really small scale experiment. And I think we've seen with ScopeX, they've had a lot of delays and the experiment hasn't happened. They proposed this experiment several years ago. And I think the experiment itself, the research and the way it's perceived has delayed the experiment, but also I think having a committee and building that takes time. I think what my hope is that Harvard investing in this model of building an independent committee that's not affiliated with Harvard is something that could be adopted and picked up very easily for future experiments that could happen in different places. But I think like this, the idea of the trade-offs between the two, it's just so hard to say because the space has moved so slowly and there's been, it's entirely hypothetical.
Any Pete?
Hi, Shuchi, terrific talk. Thanks for bringing light to a lot of important topics here. I thought about, how CDR has navigated opposition and the opportunities really for us as scholars to examine and measure costs and benefits and really identify, regions or locations that can minimize harms and maximize benefits, right? And thus, though I think global buy-in to the idea of CDR would be great, I think a lot of the kind of acceleration drivers can be very local. I think about rogue actor and CDR and direct air capture Iceland, the rest of the world's like, thanks, okay, for taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. But what I struggle with, in solar geoengineering with such a universal global impact, and you talk about procedural justice, how does that move forward without in total global buy-in? I think about a rogue actor, something out of ministry for, just essentially going rogue, and then we're left with that fallout. So how do we kind of place guardrails to address that?
Yeah, I think one of the hardest questions around solar geoengineering governance is this idea of global consent for something that's global. And I think one of the hardest things when it comes to governance is that it's kind of how I ended is that, the ideal is not going to be possible. I think what we can strive for is the least unjust as possible. And I think there are so many steps in between where we are now and where I think that could be. And I don't know what that last piece looks like. I don't think anybody knows what the best version of solar geoengineering governance is going to look like. I think what we can do now is kind of where I'm building this organization, which is to build capacity around governance, is to help people understand what this is, how they can participate in it, how they can build their own structures, and how they can participate in ongoing conversations that are happening at the international level. I think at the same time, as international conversations might start moving, this idea of civil society participation has to also expand massively. I think that's also true for CDR, to be honest. I think CDR has moved kind of exponentially in the United States, but that's not true for the global audience, right? Like we're not really seeing that conversation move in Africa or in India or in South America. And I think that really needs to shift to get to a place where CDR at scale happening in a just way is really possible. Because I think for CDR, I think the scale is such a big question of getting to a space where you're actually addressing legacy emissions, and in a way where you've built an entire multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure globally in a way that's not causing harm. And I think in a way that's just as big of a question, because I don't think the international community and like international governance community in CDR has really started to grapple with that problem either.
Yes, in the back.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I think so. This is the first time I heard of solar geoengineering. So I'm kind of like fuzzy on it. Can I ask you some questions
Yeah,
about
of
it
course,
that
yeah.
might seem like dumb? Like, so is this like controlling the weather? I don't want to, I'm not joking. Like, what is it doing, I guess? And
Yeah,
like,
so it's not,
what's the
it's not
yeah.
weather control. So there are ways that people are already doing weather modification right now in the United States, in China. Remember the Beijing Olympics when they did a lot of mechanisms to kind of clear that space from the air pollution. So that's what weather modification is, a very different thing where you try to control rainfall or precipitation patterns or all these types of things. So solar geoengineering is separate. So you're actively trying to affect climate. And so solar geoengineering would happen at a stratospheric level, where you're reflecting a very small portion of incoming sunlight that would be spread around the stratosphere globally, and then would impact global mean temperatures. And so they're kind of connected, but weather manipulation is a local process. And so when you think about the differences between solar geoengineering, weather manipulation, kind of think about the differences between weather and climate. They have inherent relationships, and climate has obvious impacts on weather and how those processes evolve. And it's similar with kind of solar geoengineering and how that impacts kind of more tropospheric weather patterns. Okay.
Up here. Is that a pipeline? Were you raising? No, okay.
Well, thank you for your talk. I had a question about what you mentioned, that we have to weigh the risk of the CDR and SG compared to the risk of the climate change. I was like, I mean, I know that there's no like definite answer for that, but because different countries have different risk assessments and different interests, I was like wondering how, like what's gonna be like the best approach or like discussions to reach to the conclusion, considering like all the different factors, and especially because like countries like Tuvalu, like for those countries, like immediate actions are like necessary for them, and they might want to like do the solar geoengineering to like reverse the effect immediately. But for the like richer large countries in the like middle altitude latitudes, they might be more hesitant towards solar geoengineering or like more like radical actions, because for those countries the risk and the uncertainties might be greater than the risk of the climate change at the moment. So like, and also that's related to the power dynamics of the global world, right? So
No, exactly. I think
yeah.
the idea of a risk framework is one it's really prevalent in how the solar geoengineering community thinks about governance. And there's a ton of papers on this if you want to look more into it. But I do think this is where a lot of the intersections of climate justice and solar geoengineering are coming into play. And I think, the ideas around who gets to decide and when and what impacts should be considered important and how many people are they affecting and what have, historical power dynamics have been that we need to atone for. And I think that's, ideas around colonialism and allowing countries to make decisions that might not have had that power before or have had that power taken away from them. These are not easy questions to answer. They're so deeply embedded in how climate change has progressed, who's responsible for that, and how really the impacts conversation has been somewhat ignored because the countries that have the most power, like the United States and Europe, aren't experiencing the same kinds of impacts as other countries. And I think that conversation has to shift. So to answer your question, I don't have an answer to your question, but I think it's one that the global community needs to start having, right? Because these questions and these options are going to start becoming a lot more salient over the next 10 to 20 years. And I think the only way we see it play out in a way that's not very chaotic or done unilaterally is to start now.
Dick.
Thank you so much. It's a fascinating exercise to think about, global phenomenon and the need for this global governance. I guess my question is about the kind of the spatial limitations of the distributional impacts. I understand that there's not been a test yet, but based on atmospheric modeling or simulations, I'm wondering, is there any local or at least regional variability in the impacts, maybe latitudinal, maybe based on weather patterns or cloud movement. And I guess depending on that, or even maybe not, but can there start to be a framework of differentiating communities, either based on their exposure to the solar geoengineering pilots or full-on deployment whenever it does happen, or just their vulnerability or exposure to weather and to temperature? Some communities being more insulated, maybe not having as much of a need for a seat at the table, and some being hyper vulnerable and exposed, maybe needing a bigger role. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think it's really hard because we just have done so little research because there's so little has been funded. And so there are some studies that have looked at kind of the regional heterogeneity of impacts. And we do see some, and there's been analyses on kind of which regions might perform better, or which ones might be neutral, or which ones might be adversely impacted. And we're seeing kind of early outputs from that kind of work. But I think what I would like to see is a lot more input from scientists in these other regions to help dictate more nuanced specific research questions that might impact, their specific spaces. And I'm hoping that that's like a much larger scale effort that, we can start to pursue. There is one organization called Degrees that's helping to fund scientists in the global South do more research, but that's one organization. And so we don't really have efforts to help build out that work yet. I do think we need, climate vulnerability indices to be more prevalent in how we're talking about solar geoengineering. And I think what I'm really trying to work on too is building capacity in those places for people to then participate in those conversations. I think one of the hardest parts of thinking about building good governance and this idea of participation is that it takes resources to enable people to participate. And I think that's a huge gap in how we think about how we get to these places where people either have a seat at the table or are able to participate in deliberations. And so plug for my work is that, I think just outcomes require building knowledge and in that kind of unbiased way to even get to the point where these systems where, figuring out who can participate, who should participate is even possible. Because the ideas around climate vulnerability indices is that they could shift. And so knowledge shouldn't be limited to those places, and it needs to be built on just a much wider scale.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, there's a lot of policy theory on how kind of new efforts require initial investments on the part of government to kind of build the capacity to, in this case, participate. And exactly those resources now allocated to those new participators creates coalitions of support around extending and growing the programs or the initiatives and the policy and so on. See a hand in the back, is that right? Or no, was that not you? Oh, sorry, it's a little gesture. I got one. I don't think I see one, right? Bill, did you weld backs onto these stools? I don't seem nearly as grumpy as I usually do.
Maybe it's me.
That I believe, that's totally believable. We got one over here. But I'm going to come back to a question I've got for you too.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. You drew this parallel earlier between CDR and solar geoengineering today and the conversations in the past of focusing on adaptation rather than mitigation. And I'm really interested in how you think that these conversations today about possible responses to global climate change are impacted by what we focus on. So I think my question is, why should we choose to, in this portfolio of responses that you mentioned, why should we choose to focus on CDR and solar geoengineering?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And I mean, for me, the reason is that they are two potential approaches that are really the only ones that can address past emissions and ongoing impacts in a way that could limit significant harm. That's why it's important to me. But I think what also is really important is who's deciding on what we're focusing on. So I think what we've seen in the United States, like among different types of communities, whether that's academics or civil society organizations, is that we've seen really oppositional organizations saying we can't talk about these things. We shouldn't talk about these things. To me, that's a very colonialistic approach to these types of things. And I'm not saying that solar geoengineering is the answer to anything. I am not advocating at all for its use or non-use. I think we need to have a lot more people who are part of that conversation of deciding what we focus on. And people might decide they don't think that this is what they would like to pursue, or people might pursue it. I don't know the answer to those questions. And I think what we've seen with like early perception studies in countries outside of the global north is that they want to talk about it, or they're interested in it. And there have been so few studies that have even gone to those places to understand that question. And so I think, to answer your question, I think the most important part is who is deciding the answers to those questions, because historically and now it's still a lot of it's global north elites. And I think we need to see how that might change with other people involved.
So we're getting closer to our box lunchtime for those of you in the room. Sorry for those of you who aren't. I have one more question, and I'll let the room have one more. So maybe the hands will shoot up after that. But I don't want to let CDR off the hook. I want to talk a little. I have a question about CDR, but I want to talk about it precisely because it's a little better defined as a free rider problem where we're likely to do too little than too much. And it's a little farther along than geosolar engineering. So we ought to be able to kind of learn from some of that, right? So, because it's clear that the GS is the GS? No, the SG. SG. The SG is, it's hard to talk about in some ways because it is so evolving and why your timing is so good on that. So, we're in a very dangerous place right now, it seems to me, on CDR, because we've got lots of technology funding in the pipeline. And it's, pretty far ahead, I think, of the policy development. So policy design is where you align a policy instrument with a policy problem, right? And everybody says the same thing about CDR, that it's very important that it be reserved for the hardest to abate activities, right? So that those that can mitigate do. So that's not a policy instrument though, right? That's a conceptual boundary, which is very coherent. But what we really need is we need a way to instrumentalize that loading order on CDR deployment, because it's the only way we truly ensure, both I think rhetorically, but also in practical terms, this idea that it's not being used to create more headroom for emissions and so on, right? And so what's your sense? It also seems to me to be the perfect time, because these policy instruments can be very complicated to design, let alone enforce. It seems to me at the very least to be a kind of a simple early move to say oil refining cannot use CDR, right? I mean, so some combination of excluding more obvious things and maybe including more obvious things. There's probably not an algorithm, but there may be that would avoid top down. What's your sense about how focused DOE is on the importance of some of the good governance of CDR?
So, I mean, there are some amazing people at DOE who are thinking about these things, but I would say just like broadly writ large, we're not thinking about governance enough when it comes to CDR. And I think that's, right now we're at such early stages of technology development that building policy around that makes sense. But I totally agree that we can't let these long-term ideas around how to kind of build guardrails around CDR are implemented. And I don't think we have enough policy people around CDR in government. I don't think we have enough CDR policy people at all. And that space has not grown as fast as the innovation space.
Right.
And I hope to see that change, because we need a lot of people involved in making sure that we're building out these systems in ways that make sense. And I think, the relationship for CDR and mitigation is so complicated, because if we want to hit net zero by 2050, how much CDR we use depends on how successful we are at mitigation, and how successful we are at mitigation is so politically volatile. And so it's really hard to think about what those guardrails should be in the context of our political systems. And especially given, that these are 5-year laws or 10-year laws that we pass. What happens after that?
Right.
And what happens if it's a Congress that's not friendly to building those guardrails? And I think there are so many really challenging questions to think through. But I would say what we're really limited by is people.
Yeah.
Being involved in this space.
You got all these, hustling engineers advancing the technology faster than, the policy people can kind of keep up with them, right? And that's why, frankly, that 2018 diagram was very useful, great kind of teaching tool, great audience tool about, the different bending the different curves. There's like you could easily do a disclaimer on that graphic, right? Because it suggests the perfect implementation.
Oh yeah, that is an
right?
ideal system.
Yeah.
That is, yeah.
Because it's all about, there's this band, right, between what should be above or below the mitigation curve that, could be captured by CDR, right?
Just a linear order of
Yeah.
in time, which
Yeah.
is not going to happen.
Yeah. Okay, so as promised, last question from the room. Oh, I heard the box lunches in there. Oh, good. Yes.
Do you know if carbon capture is being used? And if it is that as big a political football as carbon removal?
Yeah, so carbon capture exists in the world. It's on some coal-fired power plants. It's never been demonstrated on natural gas power plants, and it hasn't yet been demonstrated on industrial power plants. That is a focus of DOE right now. They got money to demonstrate that technology from the infrastructure bill that passed last year. So that's coming. I think it's a massive political football, and is even more entrenched in how the fossil fuel industry acts and the harm that they've done. And I'm not even gonna attempt to talk about it more, because it is, I think it's an even bigger political football than CDR, which is really saying something. I think there are types of CCS that are needed, like on cement plants, because we don't really have, because it's a chemical reaction producing the CO2. It's not a fossil fuel. But I think the idea of using CCS for fossil fuel based power plants is, I think, going to continue to be a huge political debate.
Cool. Great. All right. Well, thanks again, Shuchi. That was a really fun talk. Wait, don't go anywhere. Sorry, I am totally the last thing between you and your lunch. I have some notes on. So, okay, I hope we'll help you enjoy us next week for a lecture by our next visiting scholar, Meredith Fowley from Berkeley, an economist who asks a very interesting question: are utility regulators, industry regulators ready for the energy transition? A super important question. Here it is, right here. Did I get the title right? Really? I hate to have, it's like you all having the internet available to you to see if I'm getting things right. Right here behind me. I forgot about that. We'll have lunch and that lecture again next Tuesday here inside the forum. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Susan. That was good. So interesting. Yeah. And we didn't get to talk about the organization, but that's more of a private conversation. We can talk about that. Sure. Is he in here?